Ja chciałem od razu zaprosić na kolejne spotkania. 4 grudnia naszym gościem będzie pan profesor Kazimierz Łaski, a 18 grudnia, tydzień przed świętami, będzie to profesor Leon Podkaminer. A jeśli chodzi o dalsze gości w kolejnych miesiącach, w kolejnym semestrze, będziemy Państwa oczywiście na bieżąco informować. Ja jeszcze chciałbym prosić tradycyjnie do celów inwigilacyjnych o wpisanie się na listę obecności. I tymczasem przekazuję głos panu profesorowi Jerzemu Osietniskiemu. Wykład oraz dyskusja prowadzone będą w języku angielskim.
Good evening, everybody. Something has happened that totally blinds me. I can't see if that could be rearranged. But I can see no one in the hall, and this is rather uncomfortable, I'm afraid.
Only here.
Well, you know, when I talk to people, I want to see their faces. Because then I see what is the reaction, whether they follow me or I've lost them on the way. So, thanks a lot. Okay. Thanks. It's my privilege to welcome tonight Professor Thomasa Palleya. Born in Great Britain, he worked for many years in the United States in the International Labour Organization, and in the recent years he works as independent economist, mainly related to social issues or issues of economic policy making, but making in a way that would take into account social welfare of social classes, all social classes. He authored or edited a number of books, of which I would like to mention two. One is From Financial Crisis to Stagnationism, the Destruction of Shared Prosperity and the Role of Economics. That was published in 1912. And the other book is the book from, is about financialization, the economics of finance, capital domination, which was published a year later. Today, Professor Palleya will talk to us about Milton Friedman, old and new, old vintage and new vintage, and how it related, how his economics related to his social ideas. But I think it is important also to mention a number of many other important essays in economic theory that Professor Palleya wrote. Among them is a recent publication that relates to the theory of global imbalances and mainstream economics versus structural Keynesianism. I should have mentioned that Professor Palleya considers himself a structural Keynesian. He wrote also several papers in 2009-2010 that attempted to explain the 2009 crisis and the difficulties, to put it mildly, of mainstream economics to explain the sources of that crisis and to build a coherent economic policies that would help to get out of the crisis. Of those papers, one could mention limits to Minsky's financial hypothesis and the explanation of the crisis of 2009. After the Bust, that was a paper published at the Levy Institute, also 2009. America's exhausted paradigm, macroeconomics, causes of the financial crisis, and some other. Very recently, he published also a paper on monetary policy in the liquidity trap and a reassessment of quantitative easing. That was a paper published in 2013. Monetary policy after quantitative easing, the case for asset-based reserve requirement. A very interesting paper that I recommend reading to all our students, that he published this year. And also another paper, very recently published, I think, a few weeks ago, about wage-led and profit rate growth, wage-led and profit-led growth, based on Kalecki model and rooted in the distinction that was introduced many years ago by Baduri and Martin. Now, I think we should come to what is the subject of tonight's presentation, which is Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman and his reinterpretation through the lenses of a structural Keynesian. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Jersey, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to Critica for inviting me to come to Warsaw. It's a pleasure to be here. Jersey made a mention of a lot of papers. I guess I'm not so good at advertising myself, but if you do want to read them or scout them out, I have a website, and they are posted there. Just, I guess, go to Google, put in my name, and it'll direct you there soon enough. Now, as you can see, I've actually changed the title of my talk with Jersey's blessing. I originally thought, when I was being invited to speak here, that this would be an academic seminar for economists. And then I realized when I got here, people described what Critica is, that it's a broader audience that attracts political scientists, sociologists, historians, political activists. And it's a network that extends throughout Poland. People who are not here in the room tonight will be watching. And I thought to myself, well, look, the paper that I had written is a bit technical or esoteric. It would be too much of an economist's talk and wouldn't reach people in the way that I want to reach people. So I changed the focus of my talk. That's the new title, which is based on my book. But don't worry, the ghost of Milton Friedman is very present in my talk, and I will show you how he is so there. And of course, if you want to learn more about the flaws in Milton Friedman's thinking, which I think we should all be aware of, because the way the mainstream profession has promoted this man is supremely misleading for people who study economics. The paper is available, I believe, on Critica's website, and it's also available on my own website. So I've changed the talk, the title, and the focus, but I think you're going to get what we in the United States call a two for one, and that's a bargain. Okay, so my goal tonight is to explain the causes of the economic crisis, the causes of the economic stagnation, and how we can restore shared prosperity. And my talk is based on my book that Jersey has already referred to. Of course, if you like what I have to say tonight, I hope you will consider sort of going to your library and taking a look at the book and maybe recommending it to friends. The basic story that I'm going to tell is that the economic crisis and the stagnation that we are now living through is a result of contradictions in the neoliberal model that we began putting in place on a global basis in the late 1970s. And because the model is global, the stagnation is therefore global too. Now my talk is going to focus on the US economy, and let me explain why. First, there's not enough time to run through every different region of the global economy. Second, the US is where the crisis erupted initially in 2007. Third, and this is the most important point, why I'm going to focus on the US, is that the US has been the prime mover of the neoliberal model, and the US economy gives the clearest picture of the economic logic of the neoliberal model. If you understand the US economy, you are therefore going to understand, whose phone is that? It's quite if you understand the US economy, you will have a good idea of how neoliberalism works, and you will have a good idea of the contradictions within it. Now, the subtitle of my talk is The War of Ideas, and this is where I want to begin. In my view, we are living in a very critical time in history. We are fighting for what I call shared prosperity. And I define that situation of shared prosperity as one in which wages grow with productivity, and there is also full employment. So jobs are available, and workers get to share in the fruits of their labor. And we know that shared prosperity is possible because we experienced shared prosperity from roughly 1950 to the mid-1970s, or mid to even late 1970s. But since then, for the last 35 years, it has been under attack, and it has been slowly eroded until today we have been pushed into this economic stagnation. In the US, if you look at the experience of workers, in the US, workers have really had 30 years of wage stagnation. And the big macroeconomic challenge is to restore the link between productivity growth and wage growth. In Western Europe, there have really been 30 years of high unemployment, never really recovered fully from the dislocations of the 1970s. And the supreme challenge is to restore full employment. And in the rest of the global economy, you'll find some mix of wage stagnation and high unemployment. And in my thinking, wage growth and full employment are both necessary, and they are linked. It is hard to have wage growth without full employment, because workers lose bargaining power they need to drive wage growth. And likewise, it's hard to have full employment without wage growth, because lack of wage growth leads to aggregate demand shortage in an economy that has productivity growth, as do capitalist economies as a general feature of things. So the struggle for shared prosperity is also a political struggle. It involves conflicts of interest. You know, we like to say, this is back from the days of shared prosperity. I think it was John F. Kennedy who said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." But what we've learned now is that a rising tide can also lift just the big yachts and swamp the little boats. Or there can also be no rising tide at all. What I'm trying to say with that metaphor is that there is no single type of capitalism. There is no single type of economic system. The political struggle is to ensure that we choose the right type of capitalism. The type of capitalism where the rising tide does indeed lift all boats. And of course, other political interests want other outcomes. The plutocrats want a system where the tide lifts only the yachts. And dictators may be scared of any tide at all because of the change that the challenges and the changes that economic growth brings. I suppose you in Poland have a history of familiarity with that. Politics in a democratic society is always about persuasion and getting enough support for your positions. And this is where the war of ideas enters. And this is, of course, where Milton Friedman also enters the story. Ideas support interests, and interests support ideas. This dialectic is illustrated in Figure 1 here. It shows how I think of neoliberal ideas having supported neoliberal interests, and neoliberal interests then in turn supporting neoliberal ideas. There is a positive feedback between the two. Milton Friedman was the leading ideologist of neoliberalism, and his ideas gave cohesion and persuasive power to neoliberal political and economic forces. And of course, the other side of the loop is that throughout his career, Friedman received help from and was promoted by neoliberal interests that benefited from his advocacy. He was brought to Washington by the American Enterprise Institute. They ensured that he got op-ed page access. They helped publish his books and disseminate his ideas. This is how interests feed back to support those ideas that are advocating their side. The capture of the economics profession by Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics has had enormous consequences. That is because economists have contributed to the development of the neoliberal agenda, and they have also provided that agenda with justification and intellectual cover. This is how ideas feed with real force into real-life politics. Friedman's economic ideology emphasizes the stability and efficiency of markets. And it also has a deep animus to government and collective organizations like trade unions.
Excuse me to interrupt. Can I ask everyone in the room to switch off the mobile phones or turn them to the mode that they do not disturb others to listen to them, okay? Turn off or the other mode. Is that done? Okay.
So this is two-sided ideology: efficiency and stability of markets, animus to government and collective action. And that ideology now deeply infuses economics. And it is the benchmark from which neoclassical economics starts. The student movement for pluralism in economics, I don't know if you've heard of it, I think it's a global movement, I think it probably has a presence in Poland too. The student movement for pluralism in economics is absolutely right. The problem is not that neoclassical economics is taught. The problem is that only neoclassical economics is taught. And furthermore, my experience is that neoclassical economics economists suppress and exclude other points of view. Mrs. Thatcher translated that academic monopoly into the political sphere with her doctrine of TINA, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative to the neoliberal economic model. And just as Milton Friedman captured the economics profession, Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan captured our political discourse, forcing Social Democrats and the Labour Party to go along. And today, therefore, I believe our economic and political discourse is distorted because it is so framed by neoliberalism. Again, the economics students have realized that must change. But I think social democratic politicians lag behind in this. I'm trying to think why that is the case. Perhaps it is because we have a generation of politicians who have been educated as neoliberals and know nothing else. This is the power of universities. Pass through the universities, that's the only ideas they're exposed to. Even if they try and escape, they will be, to a degree, trapped in what they have been taught. Perhaps it is because politicians are cautious and prefer to follow rather than take the risk of leading. I believe that's also true. Or perhaps it is because politicians think society is not open to another discourse, and they must therefore lie low and wait until it is. Well, in my view, it's probably a case of all three. Plus, I would suspect that all major political parties, certainly the case in the United States, have to a degree been captured by neoliberal money. So that brings me back to the war of ideas. There are times, probably most of the time, when the relative power of interests is decisive for political outcomes. But there are also occasional moments when ideas take on an elevated importance. And I believe we are living in such a period now. Working families know from their own experience that neoliberalism is not working for them. The financial crisis and the stagnation have further discredited neoliberalism. The problem is that the alternative being offered by social democrats is unconvincing and generates political apathy. That's certainly the case in the United States, where I'm talking about the Democratic Party. People do not think it makes much difference who they vote for. And that sensibility reinforces Mrs. Thatcher's doctrine of Tina, which claims there is no alternative, or even worse, it leaves a vacuum that risks being filled by, what shall we call them, political swamp monsters. This is a time when ideas can have a decisive impact. In the wake of the crisis and the stagnation that has emerged, and which shows no sign of ending, there is an opportunity to challenge and dislodge neoliberalism. That is what the war of ideas is about. But neoliberalism will not roll over, because neoliberal interests are powerful and they are vested. If social democrats are going to win the fight for shared prosperity, they're going to have to understand and explain the past. Understanding the past enables us to identify what went wrong and what needs to be done. Explaining the past is the way to change people's minds so that they support the economic policies we need. So therefore, understanding, explaining, and persuading are the weapons for winning the fight for shared prosperity. Let me turn now to the crisis. Right now, society is implicitly having a debate over the causes of the crisis. And that debate is absolutely critical, because how we explain and interpret the crisis will influence greatly how we respond to it. And broadly speaking, I see three different perspectives on the crisis. Perspective number one, I call the government failure hypothesis, or the neoliberal perspective, or perhaps one should better even call it the hardcore neoliberal perspective. In the US, it is identified with the Republican Party, the American Enterprise Institute, our Chamber of Commerce, and economists like John Taylor of Stanford University. Perspective number 2 is the market failure hypothesis, or third way perspective, or perhaps one could call it the soft core neoliberal perspective. Soft core because the third way basically buys into neoliberalism, but thinks it needs to be assisted with a little bit of compassion. And I identify this market failure perspective with the Obama administration. It's identified with half of the Democratic Party, and I emphasize only half. And economists like Paul Krugman and the MIT Economics Department. And then perspective number 3, I call the destruction of shared prosperity hypothesis, or the progressive perspective, and it's identified with the other half of the Democratic Party. That half that remains true to the New Deal, the economics and policy perspectives of Franklin Roosevelt. It's the perspective of the trade unions in the United States, and it's the perspective of myself, economists like myself. But I would say that it is not visible in so-called top US and top European universities, because they no longer allow the teaching of Keynesian economics. This is this phenomenon of exclusion and expulsion by neoliberal economists and the neoliberal profession. Now, the government failure hypothesis is that the crisis was, and I'm going to talk about the US economy specifically, and maybe we can take in the question time also draw the discussion out of it. The government failure hypothesis is that the crisis was rooted in the US housing bubble. And the bubble was due to 2 failures, failures of monetary policy and a failure from government intervention in the housing market. So with regard to monetary policy, the failure of monetary policy, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates too low and for too long in the prior recession, a period 2001 to 2004. Failure number 2 was about congressional intervention in the housing market via our Community Reinvestment Act and via our, what we call Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are the government agencies that back up the private mortgage market. And they supposedly, through their interventions, drove up house prices by encouraging home ownership in people who couldn't afford it. The market failure hypothesis is really a story about financial market failure caused by inadequate regulation. The story there, this is the sort of the third way, soft core neoliberal position. We allowed excessive risk-taking by banks. We allowed perverse incentive pay structures within the financial industry that encouraged management to engage in loan pushing rather than sound lending. And we generally pushed deregulation and self-regulation too far. I must say, I like Willem Bouder, the economist, the chief economist for Citigroup, wrote in Financial Times at some stage. Self-regulation stands in relation to regulation in the same way that self-importance stands to importance. They are just not the same thing. Now lastly, or thirdly rather, the destruction of shared prosperity hypothesis is that the crisis is rooted in the neoliberal economic paradigm that has guided economic policy for the past 35 years. So yes, inadequate regulation and faulty incentive arrangements do play a role. But the point is, the problem is far deeper than just regulatory failure. The real cause of the crisis and the stagnation that we're now suffering is a generalized economic policy failure that is a result of the flaws in the economic paradigm that we have put in place. Now, the origins of the crisis are to be found in the change of economic paradigm that occurred in the late 1970s and early 1980s. From 1945 to 1975, as illustrated in this slide, the US economy was characterized by a virtuous circle Keynesian growth model built on two things. I've already mentioned them: full employment and wage growth that was tied to productivity growth. In fact, perhaps we should really call this system a Keynesian growth model, because it emphasizes wage growth, which was Kalecki's concern and not Keynes's concern very much. And the logic of the system is simple and is as follows. Productivity growth drove wage growth. Wage growth fueled demand growth and created full employment. Full employment provided incentive for investment, and investment drove further productivity growth. So you have a closed, coherent system. And what's interesting about this is that this model held in the US, and in one form or another, it held throughout the global economy. It's definitely recognizable in Western Europe. It's recognizable in Canada. It's recognizable in Australia. It's recognizable in Mexico. There you have a slight twist to suit local conditions there, where you have an addition of import substitution development being part of it. The same is true in Brazil. The same model with import substitution added into it, and the same true of Argentina. So this was a global model. But after 1980, the virtuous circle Keynesian growth model was replaced by the neoliberal growth model. And there were two key changes. I've already talked about them. Well, maybe not quite. The first is you replace the policy commitment to full employment, you abandon the policy commitment to full employment, and you replace it with a focus on maintaining very low inflation. In addition, economic policy helps corporations break the link between wages and productivity growth. And just those two changes create an entirely new model. Before 1980, wages were the engine of demand growth. After 1980, debt and asset price inflation become the engines of demand growth. That's the system of financialization that I write about in my book. Now, the new model, I describe it as a neoliberal policy box. It fences workers in and then pressures them from all sides. So you have neoliberal globalization that puts workers in international competition via new global production networks that also include trade. Jersey talked about my paper of mine on the global imbalances, which is all about this problem. You have the small government agenda, which attacks the legitimacy of government and pushes persistently for deregulation, regardless of dangers, and pushes persistently to try and weaken the social safety net that girds society. You have the labor market flexibility agenda that attacks unions, attacks labor market supports like the minimum wage, unemployment benefits, employment protections, and employee rights. And you have the abandonment of full employment, which I mentioned is replaced by inflation targeting and basically turning the management of central banks and monetary policy over to financial interests. And what's important is that this neoliberal box was implemented on a global scale in both the North and the South, and that therefore multiplies its impact. And that is the way to understand the significance of what is sometimes called the Washington Consensus, which was enforced by the IMF and the World Bank. In the 1980s and 1990s, countries needed financial assistance to escape the debt crisis. That was particularly true of Latin America. And the IMF and the World Bank made the adoption of this neoliberal policy box the condition for getting assistance. That was the significance of the conditionality debate, which I suspect also impacted Poland and Eastern Europe. Finance was forthcoming with conditions. The conditions were adopt this model. So in one form or another, you see the box implemented everywhere. It's implemented in Europe, it's implemented in the USA, it's implemented in Canada, it's implemented in Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, South Africa. It becomes the global model that replaces the virtuous circle Keynesian growth model. And of course, this neoliberal box connects to the war of ideas that I was talking about earlier, as all of these policies that are in this box were justified by the neoliberal economics profession. Metaphorically speaking, scratch any side of the box and you will quickly find the fingerprints of Milton Friedman. Friedman's ideas justified the case for small government. Friedman's idea of the natural rate of unemployment justified the abandonment of full employment as a goal of macroeconomic policy and replacing it with inflation, focus on inflation. Natural rate of unemployment theory also justifies the labor market flexibility agenda, because flexibility is supposed to bring down the natural rate of unemployment. And Friedman was, of course, a supporter of globalization, which was rationalized with the language of free trade and comparative advantage. Now, what was the role of finance in this story? The neoliberal model inevitably undermined the income and demand generation process. Put the squeeze on workers, break the link between wage growth and productivity growth, and you're going to have a demand problem. The neoliberal model therefore created a structural demand gap. And the role of finance was to fill this gap. How did we fill it? We filled it by financial deregulation, financial innovation, speculation, and old-fashioned corruption. That combination enabled finance to fill the demand gap by lending to consumers and by inflating asset prices, which created wealth that could then be borrowed against and support additional consumption. Now, the problem with this role of finance is that the process was inevitably unstable and was always destined to hit the wall. There are limits to borrowing and limits to asset price inflation. Every Ponzi scheme eventually comes unstuck. Of course, the great problem is it's impossible to predict when. The only thing we know about Ponzi schemes is that we know they will come to an end. But when, who knows? And of course, the process actually went on far longer than anyone expected. I myself thought that at the end of the 1990s we were going to begin to enter into stagnation. And in fact, I think when economic historians look back at this period, they will in fact say the recession of 2001 was the beginning of the stagnation, but we managed to pull one more rabbit out of the hat by creating this fantastic house price bubble in the United States. But there's a sting in the tail, because by keeping the process going even longer, when the collapse eventually came, it was far deeper. And it also means that escaping the after effects is far more difficult, because the economy is now burdened by massive debt burdens, and it's also burdened by destroyed creditworthiness. So where are we now? At least in the United States, the financial system has been stabilized. The credit bubble is over, so that borrowing can no longer fill the demand gap. And I think we still have an underlying structural demand gap caused by deteriorated income distribution. And actually, if you look at the income distribution numbers, the situation has gotten even worse in the recovery. The wage share has fallen further in this recovery. And what we've been doing is been filling that demand gap by a combination of large deficits and, of course, this policy of quantitative easing, which in a way is an attempt to blow air back into the bubble. And the implication is that we face a prolonged future of stagnation. There will be periods when it gets good enough or not good enough, when there is some strength in economic activity, as we're seeing now, but there's no underlying support for it, no strong foundation to aggregate demand, and so we're going to keep on having relapses. And I think this is a prediction I actually made 5 years ago, and I think the evidence now confirms its correctness. Immediately after the financial crisis of 2008, there was talk of what was called V-shaped recovery. I don't know if that talk made it to Poland. The most famous expression of that optimism was Chairman Bernanke's reference to green shoots of recovery that he made in March 2009. But the economic forecasters have been persistently over-optimistic and have had to repeatedly revise down their forecasts. That explains why we had QE2, QE3, and even now, the Federal Reserve stands ready to permanently initiate a new round of quantitative easing if weakness emerges. The forecasters have been wrong because they believe in the market failure hypothesis. Policymakers believe in the wrong theory, which means their models are wrong, which means that their predictions have been wrong. What's the role of income distribution in this story? What's the role of income distribution, at least with regard to the crisis? Well, I actually argue that deteriorated income distribution did not trigger the crisis. The trigger was the implosion of the credit bubble, of which the bursting of the house price bubble was part of it. The negative aggregate demand effects of deteriorated income distribution were actually obscured before the crisis because we had this prolonged credit bubble. However, the effects of deteriorated income distribution have now come to the front after the credit bubble burst. And so in a way, income distribution is the dog that barked after the crash and is the real problem now, and it's the problem that we haven't done anything at all about fixing. Okay. How should we respond to the crisis? What happens next? Well, that is going to depend on which of the three explanations I described wins out. Because each perspective, each explanation brings its own set of policy recommendations. This is another way in which the war of ideas is so important. For proponents of the government failure hypothesis, the recommended response is as follows. You want to double down on the neoliberal policy box. There was nothing wrong with the neoliberal policy box. We want more of it. We want to deepen neoliberal globalization. We want to deepen central bank independence. We want to deepen the commitment to low inflation. And we want to further deregulate markets. We want to further shrink government. And we also need to impose fiscal austerity because we need to deal with the increased government debt that we ran up during the crisis. And in fact, this view is making some headway. In the United States, the Republicans just won very big in our midterm elections, and there's every possibility that the Republicans could win the presidency in 2016. My prediction is that if this view wins out, and the Republicans stay true to the policies they have recommended, which are the policies I've basically just described, then we will have a deep stagnation, a very deep stagnation, that may one day be called the Second Great Depression. Indeed, this is where I think Europe is already headed because of its fatal embrace of austerity. Now, for proponents of the market failure hypothesis, this is again the Obama administration, the third way people, The response from that group is to tighten financial regulation, but continue with the rest of the existing policy paradigm. So they don't question the neoliberal policy box. They just question one piece, financial regulation. That means, as far as they're concerned, continued support for corporate globalization, continued support for so-called labor market flexibility, continued support for low inflation targeting, and support for fiscal austerity, but not fiscal austerity right now, fiscal austerity in the future when they think they've got out of the slump. This is where the Obama administration has been for much of the past 6 years. In their view, the crisis is a financial market failure, and it produced a very deep recession. There's nothing really systemically wrong. What you need to do is regulate finance, which we did through our Dodd-Frank Act, and then have, because it was a deep recession, have extreme monetary and fiscal stimulus, and that should be enough to solve the problem permanently. No deep structural problem. Now, my view is that if we stay with this course, we will continue to have the stagnation we already have. How will it manifest itself? We will stumble along with repeated need for new interventions as the effects of prior interventions wear off. And of course, there is a deep political danger, which I think we've already experienced a little bit in the United States. The danger is political support for expansionary fiscal policy will run out. And so that policy will drift into austerity with its associated dangers. Now, for proponents of the destruction of shared prosperity hypothesis, the response is fundamentally different. Policymakers need to overthrow the neoliberal policy box and replace it with what I call structural Keynesianism. We need to repack the box. We need to take workers out of the box and put corporations and finance inside the box. And then we build a new set of policies around that box that contain the power of those groups. We replace corporate globalization with a managed globalization. It has all those things like labor standards and environmental standards and financial market standards built into it. We restore the commitment to full employment. We make that a prime commitment, because only then will workers be able to bargain a share of wages and restore the link of wage growth to productivity growth. We replace the anti-government agenda with a social democratic government agenda. That concerns a social safety net, provision of healthcare insurance. Surely addressing climate change is going to need just that type of government. It cannot possibly be addressed by small government. And we're going to need to replace the neoliberal labor market flexibility with what I call a solidarity-based labor markets. Of course, in my book I do in fact spend a lot of time detailing the policies that go with each of these categories. Can't do that, don't have the time to do that now, but put this mix together and I think we have a roadmap back to shared prosperity. Now, in addition, we're going to need to sustain demand during the transition to prevent falling back into stagnation. I like to talk of this as maintaining transition velocity. We're going to have to transition between one system to a new system. And that is why we're going to need continued fiscal stimulus, why we're going to need public investment, and we're going to need monetary policy that supports fiscal stimulus and supports investment. This is a very challenging program politically. Because regaining shared prosperity involves a transition between systems, it means it will inevitably be economically bumpy. There will be resistance from neoliberal interests who are opposed to it. Transitions are always bumpy. And because they're bumpy, it means they are also always politically vulnerable. Now, let me close by coming back to the importance of ideas. At the beginning of my book, I quote Marshall McLuhan, the famed philosopher of media. And the quote is, "We shape our tools, and they in turn shape us." And I think of ideas as intangible tools, and ideas shape us. And that is why ideas matter. Ideas shape economic policy, which affects economic outcomes in ways that reinforce the power of dominant interests. Those interests then use their enhanced power to reinforce the ideas that back those policies. But ideas also work in a much, much more foundational way. They impact the way that the public thinks, what the public believes possible, and what the public expects. The political sociologist Barrington Moore argued that popular political change requires rising expectations. Today, we live in an age of diminished expectations, where people settle for crumbs, and that makes change difficult. Neoliberals have been winning the war of ideas and using their victory to downsize expectations in a way that supports the neoliberal status quo. I think of ideas as being absolutely critical because they can move the needle of expectations. Progressives are unlikely to prevail without changing expectations. And they are unlikely to change expectations without winning the war of ideas. Around 40 years ago, US wages started to stagnate and income inequality started to explode. A big reason for that is working families lost the war of ideas. Our challenge is to make sure that that does not happen again after this economic crisis. Now, if I may just make an observation of an outsider, I hope it's accurate. I think in Poland, there is a bitter irony to this history. Because at the very time that Eastern Europe was throwing off the yoke of Soviet communism and gaining freedom, the Western democracies were adopting neoliberalism. And I think Eastern Europe therefore followed the lead, naturally, automatically. That was the ideas that were being expressed by the Western democracies. Now in Poland, the outcome has been far better than what was, no doubt about that. But I think it has been far less good than what could have been. And it seems to me that the global economic crisis gives Poland an opportunity to recalibrate its economy and choose another type of capitalism. And Poland has a native son to guide the debate, and that's Mikhail Kalecki. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dom. We come to the second part of the meeting, which is questions and answers. Please introduce yourselves, and considering that I can see there is already a number of people in the hall who wish to share their comments or ask questions, try to be brief. Pani Michale, oczywiście też Pan nic nie będzie widział po to światło, ale
Thanks very much. I'm Javier Arnaut. I'm an economic historian from Mexico. Thanks very much. It was very interesting, very appealing talk. However, I have many questions and comments regarding your talk. And it's one thing that is in the media and also academic circles is this emergence of capital of the 21st century of Thomas Piketty. And well, he suggests that in the midst of crisis, and in the midst of its increasing income inequality, a policy recommendation in part of this book is to stand for a wealth income tax, wealth income tax. I would like to hear your take on that. But also another question that I had is regarding developing countries, especially Latin America. You mentioned that from 1935 to the 1970s, these countries followed successfully import substitution policies. And well, many analysts have done lots of research on this, and the transition to the neoliberal policies didn't happen from an external way, like from out of nothing. It's also many have argued that this transition to this system was an outcome of failed policies that were nurtured by these democracies, which is also very debatable about that. These countries are now living in a sort of confusion because they have tried unorthodox economic policies and orthodox policies. So nowadays there's this fear of coming back to unorthodoxy, which hasn't been successful according to their evidence. Well, that's it.
How do you want to do this?
Perhaps we take a number of questions and then okay.
I've got a short question.
Could you introduce yourself?
Piotr Stefanowski.
Yes.
I'm an entrepreneur running an investment advisory. A couple of weeks ago, I listened to the speech of David Stockman, former advisor to Ronald Reagan. He was actually promoting his book about the great deformation of American capitalism. And basically, he started a speech saying that big catastrophe is coming, the bubble is going to burst. It was basically his idea. Well, he was explaining this all through the speech, and it's all the contents of his book. My question is, do you agree with Stockman on this? Because he said it's inevitable. It's on a really crash. There were questions from the audience when. He was trying to answer that, but there was no clear answer. The speculation was about Japan, and so forth and so forth. And I would like to have your view on this. Thank you.
Thomasa Palleya, Warsaw School of Economics. Dear Professor Palleya, let me think about your book Financialization and the book of Thomas Piketty, The Capital of the 21st Century. My conclusion is that the source of the crisis is the distorted bargaining power between the global capital and the society, between the corporations and the governments, etc., etc. Could you tell us what do you think about capital controls, the control and the limitations about the free flow of global capital? Thank you.
Here and here. Okay, you do those and then we take this round. Okay, fine. Okay, okay.
Well, thank you. Well, these are all great questions. Obviously, Critica is doing something right. It's getting the right people in the room asking very informed questions. The first question about Thomas Piketty. Let me say very, very clearly, without any confusion, I think Piketty has made a marvelous, wonderful contribution surfacing the issue of income inequality. Of course, a lot of people had written about it before, but no one quite managed to get the attention that Piketty did. He and his work with Emmanuel Sayers, they brought new data to light, where the use of these tax returns instead of government household income surveys, and it's been had a remarkably good positive effect on the debate. I'm absolutely sure progressive income tax and wealth taxes too are part of the solution. But I talk of them only as part of the solution, because the way that I look at this thing and the way that I hope my talk came across to you, yes, we have a post-tax problem, but we have an even deeper pre-tax problem. And we've got to deal with the problem at the pre-tax level, because that's what gets the system up and running properly. And taxation is one of those issues that is, A, very prone to avoidance, evasion, race to the bottom, competition between governments, and it also ends up, for some reason, poisoning the political well. So let's instead deal with the problem at a pre-tax level by putting in place the policies that will deliver full employment and a system in which wages grow with productivity growth. And that is the way to really deeply solve the problem of inequality. This issue of external versus, I forgot my glasses, so now I can't even read my own writing. External versus internal. Yes, some of the policies of import substitution were indeed facing exhaustion and needed to be recalibrated. But there's one thing, recalibration, and another thing, adopting neoliberal model, like Mexico has done. Mexico was supposed to be the beneficiary of neoliberalism, of NAFTA, and it just never happened in Mexico. What you've had is a weakening of the state's capacity, a weakening of society. I tie the problems of drugs, I tie the problems of immigration, unauthorized immigration to the United States. All of these things, I tie them to the neoliberal NAFTA model. Mexico got a very short burst of support when NAFTA was put in place, but then found all those gains, or much of those gains, leaked away when China was admitted to the global economic trading system. So the model doesn't work. And I think that, so therefore, we need a new model of development that, actually I haven't really talked about how that fits in here, because if you think of the global economy, you have a neoliberal box in the south, and you have a neoliberal box in the north, and the global economic system is the interface between them. And so we've got to get that interface right. We know that it'll be hard to put in place a structural Keynesian system that works in a global economy where we don't fix that interface. Because if once upon a time the competition was north versus south, very strongly in the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of the north is deindustrialized now, that north-south dimension has actually weakened substantially. It's still there, but it's much weaker than it was in the 1980s and 1990s. And we have a really ugly new development called South-South competition. And these developing countries, even as they acquire new technologies, production capacity, and so on, do not get the benefit of, do not get benefits from those developments, because they're in a race to the bottom against their rivals. I talk of this about, I call it barge economics. It's an idea that I got from listening to Jack Welch, who was the former CEO of General Electric. He talked about, this is his expression on radio, saying, ideally, I would like every one of my factories to be on a barge. And then I could float the barge around to wherever costs were lowest. It might be due to an undervalued currency, it might be due to lack of regulation, it might be due to exploitable labor, low wage costs. whatever. There's an array of factors, and the barge is the vehicle for this race to the bottom. And we've got to find a way of anchoring the barge and preventing corporations from taking advantage of that dynamic that is available to them in this new globalized world. The entrepreneur's question about Stockman. Well, Stockman has been calling this for a long time. When I wrote my book in 2010, actually, opening chapter was "Goodbye financial crash, hello stagnation." I think that's absolutely right. 2010, we haven't had another financial crash, but we have had stagnation. And I think stagnation is the more likely outcome. Though I could see rolling bubbles, it is possible. You can, if you try and revive this thing on the basis of asset price inflation alone, and you don't fix the fundamentals, you could see some sort of financial crisis developing in the future. I don't quite see it in the way that Stockman does. I think that what would seem to be the current system is a dollar standard, and the dollar seems very stable. The thing that really throws this thing into reverse is the emergence of some kind of inflation. And that doesn't seem to be on the horizon right now. In fact, if anything, deflation seems to be deepening with the sort of the end of people talk about the end of the commodity super cycle. So, of course, who knows? But one wants to impose some sort of remember, I guess what's the better word? A broken clock is right twice a day. I'm sure there will be a financial crisis at some stage in future history. I don't know whether that makes David Stockman right. I don't think so. I think right now the problem is stagnation. And then the bargaining power. Yes, this is absolutely critical. I mean, in this box here, in the full presentation in the book, actually, think about a box with 4 sides. It's not very stable. You can actually flatten it. A box really has 6 sides. And so what are the other sides of this box? Well, it's corporations and financial markets. They give the strength to the box. And that's why when I repack the box, I want to put corporations and financial markets inside. And that's why you need financial regulation. That's why I think corporate governance is a very big part of the agenda. It's not a typical macroeconomist issue. I try to talk about it in my book on financialization, because so much of the bad stuff that's happening is being funneled through corporations. In the United States, it's through CEOs and massive, when you take the CEO, the wage share doesn't look like it's gone down so much in the official numbers, or it has in the last 10 years, but from 1980 to 1990, it didn't look like it had gone down so much. Well, why is that? Well, CEO pay and top 5 executive officer pay are counted as part of labor income. And so there's a massive distortion within what was the true sort of realistic, meaningful wage share. And we have to get a way of getting a grip back on corporate governance so that corporations don't reward in such an extreme way these top officers at the expense of the corporation. Corporations are not so financially oriented. Corporations aren't so short-termist in their perspective. Corporations aren't so antisocial in their behaviors. Corporate governance is a critical part. And if we talk then extending it to the international economy and bringing my comments back to connect with the question about Mexican development, of course capital controls must be a piece of this. They must be in the toolbox. In fact, I was talking with Jersey today, just before this meeting, about, of course, the problem that Poland is now facing. It has a slightly higher interest rate than the rest of Europe. In fact, I think the ECB has a negative deposit rate. Given that, there is a natural tendency, well, we've got pretty good credit rating, stable politics, actually embedded with a member of the European Union, this would be a nice place to park short-term liquid funds. Well, if you had a full toolbox of capital controls, you could impose what we call Chilean unremunerated reserve requirements. Money that came in, but maybe every dollar you bought in, you'd maybe have to put 20 20 cents on deposit with the central bank, earning 0 interest. And you have to put it on deposit for a year. That's how the Chileans did it. There are 2 things that happen when you do that. One is you lower the effective return that your inflow earns, and the other is you expose it to exchange rate risk, because a year from now, who knows what it would be. This is a great way to prevent inflows, a great way to prevent the appreciation of your currency that will do so much damage to your industries, which, as we know, because of globalization, every industry is so sensitive to the exchange rate because of this barge phenomena that it can't be done. It's not part of the toolbox within the European Union. Other countries should be using it. We need to do other things. There are things we can do with, there are controls we can do within countries, and we must do things between countries. And as part of that capital controls thing, I also, of course, put in exchange rate management, coordinated exchange rate management. The fluctuating exchange rate has been a disastrous for countries. Periodically, it's a rotating problem. It's coming back, unfortunately, again, to hurt manufacturing workers, with the dollar now hitting all-time highs. And actually, I think this could be one of the things that may, 6 to 9 months from now, when we have more weakness in the American economy, it might be due to the fact that the exchange rate appreciation derails the nascent recovery that we're starting to feel now.
Thank you very much for interesting presentation. It's an interesting lecture. I would like to bring to your three perspectives. Perspective number 1, 2, and 3. And the perspective number 2 and 3 were about market failure. And my question is, could we combine the perspective number 2 and number 3, and just try to imagine, just ask, why we have market failure? Because I think because we do not understand fully the market mechanism. Market is the game between demand and supply. And I suggest to consider one more element, that each market has demand, supply, and organizer of each market. When you look for market, labor market, money market, and goods market, you can find that the organizer is different, and the role of organizer is completely different. And first of all, you mentioned the labor market, full employment. I think that you also, it's a small question, you probably, full employment, you mean, say, natural employment, about, say, 3–4% unemployment, because zero unemployment never happened in the United States history. So simply which, you looked that the labor market is over-regulated market, where demand is not equal to supply, and never will be back to say such situation. And then the question is how to organize. Simply, labor market is completely different, it's changing very rapidly, because it's not right now, you should, I suggest to distinguish between creative labor and routine labor. And demand for routine labor is shrinking very, very fast, and we cannot avoid it. So the only idea is to look for different organization of labor market. And this is completely different market. It will be market. You are, and me, simply I'm working in the Polish Academy of Sciences, so Professor Szatiński also, we are creative labor, creative worker, and completely different.
At least we like to think of ourselves.
Sure, yeah, that's it. Please. But anyhow, that is completely different market, and we should try this, understand why. What happens with labor market, this idea with money market, and also with good market. Right now, when we have internet, recent development, and so on. So simplified question is, can we combine perspective number 1 and number 2? Okay, thank you.
Tim Clapham, British Labour Party. First of all, you've taken a particular American perspective, and I would like to suggest to you that, in fact, in Europe, in fact, the war of ideas is being won. I refer to The Economist's comments on this matter, I refer to the Financial Times comments on this matter, I refer to the support that's being received by push for by INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and I refer to the fact that Oxford has Chang and others who are pushing this. The problem, therefore, is one that these ideas are not yet being accepted by the broader public. And I want to break that into 3 points, one of which is particularly relevant to you, because I agree with my colleague that the fundamental problem is the problem of lack of labour power, and therefore of the strength of the trade unions. Now, I would like to ask you, as an advisor to the American trade unions, why have the trade unions been so unable to get to grips with this situation? I find it astonishing that they have allowed this situation to continue for so long in many countries. The second problem, in terms of the public, the big problem appears to be that any of these solutions appear to involve government spending. And there's currently an obsession, an austerity obsession, about government GDP debt ratios. How can you cope with that? Because I think this area, if we are to get public acceptance, that area has to have an intellectual coherence, which I have not seen. Inequalities received and other things, but this debt GDP ratio has not yet been had an intellectually coherent argument that I am aware of. And the third point that concerns me, you talked about the battle of ideas. Are we not at a key point in terms of TTIP? Because may I suggest that in fact, if TTIP goes ahead, we are basically losing the battle of ideas, because this reinforces and codifies neoliberalism as the international global order. Thank you.
Hans Peter, I'm a sociologist. I wanted, that's my problem.
Sociology is where it's at in life.
No, because in this neoliberal, in this Friedman model, you have a clean model. You have only 2 actors, basically, the investors and the workers. And as long as you have no intervention from outside, the thing is working, the mechanism. You need cross, because without cross, the thing comes to a stillstand. And I think the mistake is that in every model, in every mechanism, there is an end. It is not an everlasting machine, which is going on and going on. This was proved by Gödel in mathematics, because mathematics was thought to be has an inbuilt stability without an impact from outside. It turned out not to be clear. But then what you propose, the second perspective, the third perspective, is this an extended economic model where just you have more actors, as for example governments or central banks or labor unions are players of are economical players inside, or is it? I don't know really what is the economic model, because I always hear we have to have an impact on this. We have to forcen, or we have to strengthen, but we have to strengthen from outside the economical system or model. I think it turns a little bit what you say. It says we have different. What is labor market? Is it the same labor market? Is it the same than bear market, and so on and so on? So could you please try to give a theoretical explanation how you see the problem?
Is there anyone else?
Wiem, że tam jest. Jeszcze proszę.
Jan Natasha, Warsaw School of Economics. I just wanted to rephrase this question of a big bubble coming. It refers to stock market, real estate market, and the bond market. My question is, what's your opinion on the current situation of US economy? It refers to this QE policy, I mean the QE3, which will be probably shortly after replaced by QE4, 5, and so on. Which personally reminds me more and more of Rocky movie series. I mean, it's coming to infinity. And how can we talk about the stagnation when the US debt is more or less estimated to nowadays more or less to $80 trillion.
I think we can accept still another question if there is one. Okay, and that is the last question, and then we come to answers.
I would like to go, I'm quite like you, I'm a sociologist from Warsaw University. I would like to go back to the problem of solidarity and what you call the diminishing expectation. Isn't that what we see at the time just before the bubble burst in 2008, and we see Americans taking mortgages more and more? Don't we see the people that were actually hoping for the better world? And don't you think that this experience has a still lasting stain in the American economy? And here I'd like to make a bridge to Polish experience, because we have a lot of mortgage credit people with mortgages in Swiss franc that are tightly attached to the exchange rate, fluctuating and changing enormously their home budgets. And they are very often on the verge of a default, but they seem to have a lot of hopes, and you don't see the frustrations. They seem to believe in the individual fate, in the individual shaping of. So they basically are very well attached to the neoliberal idea of individualism. So where the solidarity movement or the backup for solidarity would stem from, in your opinion?
Okay.
Well, before you, can I get a word? Before we start answering, let me get one thing corrected. This is not true that the Swiss franc creditors are on the verge of default. Those credits are perhaps best served throughout the whole banking system. And there is no problem whatsoever that there is a higher rate of probability of those creditors becoming defaulted compared to those who took credit in zlotys. So I think, and those are the statistics, and those are the facts. Otherwise, please.
Well, the first question, part of it was, what is full employment? There are many definitions. Lord Beveridge, the founder of the British, or the inspiration behind the British welfare state, had a definition of the number of vacancies equals to the number of unemployed, a job for every person. Keynes, in his book, had another definition, which was that if you increased aggregate demand, you didn't generate any more employment. Increases in aggregate demand would purely generate price inflation, and the implication being there that full employment will be associated with some, you'll only get close to that sort of condition when you have some non-zero level of inflation. The definition that I have used, that I came up in a paper that I wrote half a dozen years ago, is I define full employment as a situation when wages grow with productivity growth. That's supposed to be the equilibrium in classical theory, and if you're not getting that, you're away from full employment, and if you're getting more than that, assuming it's not a compensation for some prior disequilibrium, then you're above full employment. I think it was Supreme Court Justice Potter, I think was his name, who said that full employment is a bit like pornography. We don't know how to define it, but we know it when we see it. And that's sort of the operational definition that I go with on full employment. Now, I don't think that perspectives 2 and 3 are the same. So obviously, it's quite possible to combine them, and I think I do. I talk about there is a need for financial market regulation. There is a need for ongoing fiscal and monetary stimulus to maintain what I suppose is transition velocity. But there's a new economic model that embeds a different concept of markets and the functioning of the economy. This is not a Valrasian economy of contracting. This is an economy of aggregate demand. You don't get to full employment unless you have enough aggregate demand. Price flexibility and nominal wage flexibility won't get you to full employment. In fact, they're quite likely to push you in the other direction. In labor markets, you're talking about power relations. Within corporations, you're talking about power relations. You're talking about social relations, about sociology within these institutions. And that's what drives and determines returns to different factors. This is not a world of marginal products. This is a world of socially negotiated income distribution. Yes, even sometimes, and this is a problem, sometimes there can be apparent policy equivalence, these observational equivalence in the policy recommendations, but the theories behind why you arrive at those policy conclusions is totally different. And if you take away and try and run into the future with that, having the wrong theory will get you in trouble in the future. Having the wrong theory will get you doing the wrong things in the future, and that's why it's right to get the theory and the ideas right now. Well, I was a bit surprised I do recognize that there are big differences between the political consciousness and political situations of Europe and the US, but having asserted that Europe is winning the debate, you then proceed to reel off a number of reasons for me to doubt that they are, including the continuing obsession with fiscal austerity, including the fact that TTIP has made it onto the agenda, and it really is this idea that free trade is now all about regulation, licensing arrangements, copyrights, public health administration. I never read about that in Ricardo, and that they can even call this free trade is, it's outrageous, intellectually outrageous, and they should be challenged on it. But yes, there are some pieces. Obviously, the bankers have capitulated. The central bankers, this is. They need zero interest rates. There is a debate around fiscal austerity, but it's not been won by any means. It's not been won, as I understand it, in Britain. It's not been won in Europe. And I look at the polls. I didn't see the Social Democrats running away with the election in Germany. I don't see the Labour Party running away with the elections in Britain. So I think we're very much in the war of ideas, though the configuration, the exact details of it play out differently across these two continents. I do notice for a very long time, I've always talked about how strangely, when I try and look back over this last 30 years and understand the experience of the European continental economy and the American continental economy, and I have sort of my simple frame that I go to as a sort of a micro-macro divide. And what I see in Europe is you have a sort of social democratic microeconomics. The reality is social welfare state is a better welfare state than in the US, so you've been doing a lot to weaken it, from education, universities, health insurance. The retirement income isn't so. It seems to vary across countries. But there is a social democratic inclination, and I think that social democratic inclination is much better lodged within European citizens than American citizens. This is a very important point, and I think that this is one of a fantastic thing for Europe. I would like Europe to talk, by the way, much more about its fantastic things and stop trying to copy being American. This is some fabulous things in Europe that Americans would love to have. But even as you have this social democratic microstructure in place and social democratic micro-inclination, in fact, your macroeconomics was much more captured by neoliberals. It's reflected in the ECB. It's reflected in the Maastricht Treaty requirement. It's reflected in the way that the currency was designed. There were people writing about how dangerous this was, that it was a bad institutional arrangement, and nothing was done about it. Europe has been pursuing this macroeconomic agenda of austerity now for 25 years, along with the labour market flexibility agenda. And what it did is it produced deeper unemployment, more persistent unemployment, even as the social democratic microstructure managed to tamp down the worsening of inequality. So you don't have quite the same CEO pay problem here. I think in part that's because, certainly in German companies, the German unions wouldn't allow it. But the danger is, I think, that unemployment effects will trump inequality effects. As far as working people are concerned, you must have a job to live, and it's therefore essential politically to have full employment, and persistent unemployment would be a political disaster. It will unleash terrible political possibilities. Interestingly, the Americans play it the other way around. Our microeconomics is much more neoliberal. We have allowed the minimum wage to be savaged. We don't have public health insurance options. We have Obamacare, which is an improvement over what was there, but nothing like what I think a public health system should look like. Our education has been defunded. The share of government spending in the economy, if you strip out our defense establishment and you strip out the interest on debt, government share of GDP has been collapsing now for years. But we also have, on the other side of it, the Americans are quite clever. I think we have a sort of a form of plutocratic Keynesianism. Keynesianism doesn't automatically have to be sort of social democratic. I think it can be turned and used in that way, but the plutocrats in America have also realized that. And so what did George Bush do in 2001? First thing he asked for was a massive tax cut, which was Keynesian, but it was oriented towards to benefit the rich. And America has therefore done much better on the employment front than it has on the wage front. It's kind of the mirror opposite of the US. But in neither country is the war of ideas won. And in neither country, in our own Democratic Party, certainly not. And I think you saw how well the Democrats did in the last election. So I don't share your optimism. I think we have a fight in front of us. I think that the question about sociology models from sociologists' perspective, well, to me, a model is a metaphor. I never think of it as a mirror of reality. And it helps organize the current landscape and helps me think about it. And that's all that I've tried to do here. You want to keep your models simple, otherwise the value of the metaphor begins to decline very rapidly. One of the problems with neoclassical economists, they neither realize that they don't realize that these models, their own models, are metaphors. They think they're mirrors, and they make them so complicated that they have no really insight into it, and the theory behind it is wrong too. So, yes, we want to build in different type of actors: debtors and creditors, workers and capitalists, different sectors, different domestic economy, international economy, power relations. All these sociological insights are very real, and above all, we want to turn the lens of sociology on ourselves so that we understand where our thoughts about the economy are coming from, and they're not that we don't think of ourselves as being economists standing outside of the economy and not being and having some sort of a philosopher's lens on the economy that is not impacted. I don't have too much to say about the US economy. The US economy right now is going through a good spell. There are, as I said, we haven't fixed the real problems of inequality. The closer we get to, I do see contradictions ahead. The closer we get to full employment, soon we will start to see wage growth, which will be very, very welcome. At that stage, you will see the neoliberals putting up pressure to put the brakes on. You'll also see some contradictions in the following form. I mean, asset markets may be a bit overvalued. When I look at an asset market, I have a very simple valuation model. I take earnings per share by the interest rate. As you get to full employment, you're going to start to see wage growth, which is going to probably put a dent in earnings per share, and you're going to see the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, which will put a dent in raise interest rates. both together, I do see therefore that there could easily be some financial turmoil ahead. I'm afraid of that financial turmoil being misinterpreted. It's the product of using tools to address a crisis, and we needed to do that because we needed to save the day, as it were, but they didn't address the deep problems of the model. We haven't solved the model, we've just sort of blown air back into it, and that's not a fix. And then this question of solidarity is absolutely key. I think it is the essential problem today. How do we rebuild solidarity amongst the citizenry, which is the basis of political success? We have a problem in the state of Wisconsin that some of you might have read about. The governor is going after public sector workers who, given the deteriorated conditions of private sector employment, now private sector, their neighbors look at them and say, why do you have a pension plan when I don't? And this is completely the wrong solution. They want to take away the rights, the bargaining rights and the pension rights of public sector workers. It's blaming the public sector workers for their own predicament. Now, it's a very natural thing. Freud actually talks about this, about, you look to small differences, you look to your neighbor, that's who you compare yourself against. In fact, your neighbor is not the cause of your problems, it's the bosses on Wall Street, the corporations, the fact that they own the politicians who put in place the rigged game that is the economy. But how do we turn people's eye to look there, understand there, when it's very natural? They aren't economists, they're not sociologists, they're not public policy experts. They look to their neighbor, and they are prone to very natural human feelings, and it's the role of politicians to turn and pull the gaze of people away from turning into a dog-eat-dog fight with their neighbors, and turning their eye to the real problems of our system. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I think, winding up our tonight's meeting, I would like to make just 2 points that were earlier emphasized by Professor Palleya. One is the relationship between wage growth and full employment. I think this is an overriding theme that I think will also be discussed extensively when we meet next time and listen to Professor Lasky. I think as long as we remember that automobiles do not buy automobiles, cars don't buy cars, people buy cars. And if people do not have enough money to buy cars, there will not be investment, and therefore not sufficient demand to generate full employment. And if this demand gap is not supplemented by budget deficit, in most EU countries, for Maastricht criteria and stability pact cannot be done, then you really have 2 alternatives, neither of which is really sustainable in the long run. One is subsidizing consumption growth by consumer credit, with the resulting credit bubble, and what we have seen to lead to 2007-8 crisis. Or the other one is labor or wage rate dumping, which is of course not a solution for all countries in the region, and as a matter of fact, considering that the rate of export surplus, the share of export surplus to GDP is of the order of anything between 3 up to whatever 8% in Germany at best. And the share of wage-generated consumption is 40 or more percent, is as a rule unable to compensate for losses in consumption, and GDP grows, and as a rule also may well result in sustained unemployment. So if you really want to have long-term full employment, the only sustainable way to get it is, as Tom emphasized, rate of growth of wages more or less the same as that of labor productivity, so that income distribution is more or less constant. And the other point that I wanted to make is, at one stage, Tom said, with regret and remorse, he mentioned the exclusion of Keynesian economics. Just as well, we might add, even to a greater degree, exclusion of Keynesian economics. What we have recently mentioned towards the end of our discussion about this reduction of taxation of the rich is not an instrument that could ever be thought of in terms of Keynesian economics, because of very propensities to save out of profits and out of wages, out of high wages and out of low wage. Okay. I think this is what is really important when we think in terms of the present day post-Keynesian, whether of the structuralist or other varieties. What are the factors that are able to generate sustainable economic dynamics that would result in full employment, and using also the capacity of technological progress, because this is also investment related. Now, having said this, let me thank again Thomasa Palleya for his excellent presentation and his visit here, and applaud him for excellent presentation. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone.
Tylko jeszcze powtórzę, 4 grudnia będzie